Kia ora tātou, ngā mihi nui, and welcome to this third webinar in our Religious Diversity Centre series, E Tu Te Mana o Te Ao, Building a Climate of Hope. I'm Jocelyn Armstrong, co-chair of the Religious Diversity Centre, with a word of introduction. In our first webinar, Dr. Jane Goodall gave us reasons for hope amid the realities of climate change. And in the second, Rabbi Shapiro introduced us to three New Zealand scientists who, with their PowerPoint presentations, so clearly outlined the situation, present and future, under climate change for Aotearoa New Zealand. This third webinar is to direct our sights beyond our shores into the wide Pacific region, the region where New Zealand's neighbouring nations have led the way for us, experiencing extreme weather events and the impacts of rising sea levels. But they've also led the way for us as Religious Diversity Centre, presenting our webinar series. For 2 years ago, in July 2021, a series of 20 podcasts entitled Catching the Last Wave was produced by the Pacific Conference of Churches, the organisation that brings the various Christian denominations together across 19 Pacific states and accounting for some 80% of their populations. In the podcasts, and they're still available today, Pacific leaders and experts acknowledge that climate change is already and will continue shaping the way communities are living in the Pacific. They explore the issues related to climate change and what can be done to address them at local, regional, and global level. But tonight, we are in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we are to view the Pacific region with a member of the Pacific Climate Warriors as our guide. The Pacific Climate Warriors is a youth-led grassroots network active in the Pacific Islands and also in the diaspora in Australia, United States, and in New Zealand. So now I'd like to invite Rod Oram as the moderator of this evening's webinar to introduce our keynote speaker and our discussion group. Thank you, Rod.
Kia ora tātou to everyone online, and thank you very much, Jocelyn, for that very warm welcome and for all your leadership in helping us develop this webinar series. Just a brief description of the plan for the next hour. It's a great pleasure to have Mary Moeono-Kolio here as our main speaker, and I'll introduce her shortly. And Mary will speak for perhaps about 15 minutes on key issues on her mind about the Pacific climate issues. And then I'll introduce two panelists who will join in a discussion with Mary, which will take us through until about 10 past 8, in which case we'll have been stockpiling questions from you, the audience, and we'll get to as many of them as we can in the remaining 20 minutes or so of our webinar. But if there's still a big flow of questions, we'll probably keep going a little bit longer. So feel free to leave right on 8:30, but we might sort of stretch that by about 10 minutes if there's still lots to discuss. Now, one other thing before we start, if I may, we're delighted that we're able to offer this webinar series for free. But we've asked all of our speakers if they could nominate some climate activities that they think are very worthy for funding. And we want to make our contributions to those through donations. So our appeal is to you in our audience to to use one of two channels we're about to offer you in the chat box to make donations. And the money would be going to the Jane Goodall Institute, seeing as Jane was our first speaker in the series. And then next will be climate projects here in New Zealand, nominated by the three climate scientists that Rabbi Dean was discussing things with last week. And then the funding will also go to the Pacific Climate Warriors for their projects, thanks to Mary's contribution this evening. And then lastly, our final speaker in the series next Wednesday is the Right Honourable Helen Clark. And so she's got some ideas about how the Helen Clark Foundation will be able to use that fund. So Richard Milne, one of my colleagues in the Religious Diversity Centre Climate Action Group, has just will be pasting very shortly those links to you. One is a Give a Little page, which we've set up specially for that, or alternatively, it's possible to donate through the Religious Diversity Centre's website, which has a donation function. Excuse me. And now, it's my very great pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker this evening. Mary Moeono-Kolio is a young Samoan professional based in Wellington, and she is, as I mentioned, a 350 Pacific Climate Warrior member and the Wellington coordinator of that. As Jocelyn mentioned, the Climate Warriors are a very dynamic group of young-led grassroots activists. And this is a manifestation of Mary's wider interests. So she's a very strong advocate for educational equity and climate justice. And Mary believes a restorative justice approach must underpin the climate conversation. And she is also, of course, a strong advocate that young people have the energy, the passion, and the courage to be innovative and compassionate thinkers that will change the world and will solve the crisis, and indeed do give us hope amidst all the difficult news we have to deal with climate. Now, Mary holds a Master of Arts with honours in criminology from the University of Auckland, where she researched restorative justice as a culturally appropriate approach for dealing with violent offending here in Aotearoa. And in her day job, she holds a senior role in the Ministry of Education, working with Pacifica students. So, Mary, it's a huge pleasure to have you with us this evening, and we're very keen to hear what you want to tell us about climate and the work of you and the Climate Warriors. So, over to you.
Well, thank you, Rod, and thank you for that kind introduction. I do want to clarify, my brother and I started the Wellington chapter for the Pacific Climate Warriors in 2018, and I led it for a wee while, and now it's handed over to the lovely Kaloawhiaki and Bethany Mataiti, who are now leading that. So also really proud that we've been able to build leaders as well in that space. So just wanted to acknowledge that. I also really want to thank Paul, Jocelyn, and everyone at the Religious Diversity Centre and everyone behind the scenes who've been able to make this webinar series a reality, and of course everyone that's joined us to be part of this dialogue tonight. So malo lava. Talofa lava, tēnā koutou katoa ko Mary Moeono, Mary Ngafa o Malietoa sa pati Moeono-Kolio ahau, but you can call me Mary. I'm from the villages of Whalewha, Tiawea, Le'auwa'a, and Malia in Samoa. I'm a proud daughter of the Pacific, and I, like many others, are doing all in our power to fight for climate justice. A fight that I and many others also know we might not necessarily live to see the fruits of, but one that's really grounded in the hope that generations to come will not have to fight for the survival of their homes. Like many Indigenous and First Nations peoples, I come from a people who have lived in harmony with creation for some 3,000 years. Throughout that time, our ancestors used this relationship to navigate the length and breadth of the Pacific Ocean. to settle new lands, build entire cultures, histories, economies, philosophies, centered on understanding and nurturing the world around us and understanding our place in it. Growing up in Samoa, I was not only surrounded by the beauty of my home, but frequently confronted with the devastation presented by a climate growing more unstable year after year. My parents now live and look after a beautiful piece of land on this kind of peninsula of the mountain that overlook the sea, located on the northeastern coast of Upolu, and lovingly known by family and friends as the Maunga, or the mountain. This maunga has provided shelter to my family at the most challenging of times, has been the center of countless celebrations, has been a refuge to many, and literally feeds a family and a village. It's also where my parents are the happiest and healthiest, and is everything that I'm fighting to preserve and protect. As many of you will know, for the Pacific Island nations, the climate crisis is not a distant threat, but a daily and lived reality that we have been warning the world of for the last 3 decades. A reality that many in Aotearoa are now beginning to feel more and more. Which is why I'm here this evening to highlight not only the leadership and courage of Pacific peoples and communities, but to speak to our unrelenting faith and hope in the power of people to solve the climate crisis. Climate change is more than just an environmental issue, but a manifestation of a much larger ecological crisis, not of our own making, but one that the Pacific are evidently the first ones to suffer from. My dad has seen within a period of under 50 years, his primary school grounds disappear under the waves, and his mother's village of Tiawea, where he grew up, essentially deserted due to the frequent and severe weather events such as cyclones and floods that have rendered the village uninhabitable. A few years ago, Pope Francis released Laudato Si. In it, he reminds us that we are faced not with 2 separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. The impacts of climate change is by its very nature a violent act that has been born out of greed and self-interest, and we must overcome it with every tool at our disposal, especially as communities of faith. Simply put, climate change, driven by the continued proliferation of fossil fuels, is one of the greatest acts of violence and destruction that my generation is witnessing play out in real time. And so it's not only within our power, but our moral duty to stand against it. While many communities, including the Pacific, have been mobilizing for years to try and reduce emissions and prioritize building a cleaner and safer world, the coal, oil, and gas industries, enabled by governments, have been rapidly producing and expanding fossil fuels that we don't need and continue to drive catastrophic warming. In saying that, the same colonial and greed-fueled capitalist system that caused this crisis will not provide the solutions. Instead, we must be decolonial and collective in our thinking and let young Indigenous people and those on the front lines lead. Leaders across the Pacific have called out time and time again that climate change is the single greatest threat to the security and prosperity of the Pacific. For decades, it has been the Pacific leaders and communities who have exemplified the leadership, political willpower, and fortitude it takes to address the climate crisis. This was evident when, led by the Pacific, the world came together to agree on a target of 1.5 in the Paris Agreement, which the late Tony de Broom from the Marshall Islands is credited as being one of the principal architects. So while the Paris Agreement begins to limit emissions, it includes very few mechanisms to stop or slow the production of fossil fuels. In fact, despite Pacific leaders' best efforts, it doesn't actually mention coal, oil, or gas in its contents, which is why we need a global plan to end the production of fossil fuels and fast-track solutions. Which brings me to a new initiative, rooted in the Pacific's decades-long climate leadership and now has growing international support. It's in September of last year, Vanuatu became the first country to call for the development of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, a proposed international agreement to phase out the extraction, production, and consumption of fossil fuels and to enable a just and equitable transition to renewable energy. We can no longer wait for the business as usual processes that has wasted 30 years only for incremental gain. A fossil fuel treaty would phase out coal, oil, and gas faster, more fairly, and forever, while supporting workers and communities and countries dependent on fossil fuels to transition. In less than a year, 6 more Pacific governments have joined the call for a treaty, including 80 cities worldwide, 3,000 scientists, over 100 Nobel laureates, and thousands of young people across the globe. What started in the hearts of Pacific young people in 2015 has grown to an international campaign that is shaking the foundations of both the climate movement and the fossil fuel industry. Many have said that this is too ambitious, or that we're setting our sights too high, or that we should stick to the current processes. But the people of the Pacific refuse to lose our home and refuse to accept the pace at which we're moving. So we're making this stand not with violence, but by deploying something far more potent and impactful. Our cultures, our wisdom of our elders, the tenacity of our young people, and our unrelenting faith and hope for survival. So if in a human moment you find yourself faltering or giving in to the cynicism that often plagues us in this space, think of those on the front lines. Think of those of us in the Pacific, our leaders, our elders, who despite suffering the height of injustice in this climate crisis, continue to be compelled into action, fueled by love, and sustained by hope. Kia ora.
Thank you very much indeed, Mary, for setting that not only very challenging context in which you're working, but giving us real hope with the example of the non-proliferation treaty idea coming out of Vanuatu. And we've got lots of wonderful themes to follow up with in due course. Before I introduce our 2 panelists who are going to have a discussion with Mary on this, I would just like to urge you, please, to offer us questions. You'll see the Q&A box down there in the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you click to open that up, then you'll see where you can enter questions, and I can see those coming up too. So that will be very helpful for me in due course. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our 2 panelists this evening. The first one is Dr. Roro Daniel, who was born in Aitutaki in the Cook Islands, and is a medical doctor by training and long profession. Very active not only in his own country in the Cook Islands, but across other Pacific Island countries. And he's also taken on some global roles, as, for example, he was for a period chair of the World Health Assembly and has worked at the highest levels of policy health making around in various parts of the world. The second person I'd like to introduce is Adam Curry, Dunedin born and raised, an environmental campaigner who I noticed on his LinkedIn page calls himself a policy comms nerd with the future to lose. So like many young people who are leading the way, he has that huge sense of responsibility there. Active in the past with, for example, Greenpeace here in Aotearoa as its agriculture and climate comms lead. And now he's with 350 Aotearoa, another fine global organization of young people, very effective here in New Zealand, as the campaigns and communications advisor. Adam's background started at the University of Otago and then finished off his BA at McGill University in Montreal, and then came back to Otago to do a master's degree in peace studies and conflict resolution. So Adam, it's a great pleasure to have you with us this evening. So if I may start by inviting the two of you, excuse me, perhaps if I suggest Ro first, or to offer us some thoughts about what you heard from Mary.
I'd like to thank you, Mary, for your talk. I think you had covered the problems that all of our Pacific Islands are experiencing. And also I was interested in your remedy for these problems and the initiative of your ending fossil fuel use. And I hope it will come soon. I think we should put timelines on this. But anyway, Rod, thank you for the introduction. In your introduction, there is one crucial detail missing. It is to do with the most precious in my life. These are my 13 mokopuna and one great moko. Their future as young Maori and Pacific Islands children already stand to be seriously and negatively impacted by climate change. My responsibility is to protect them. And the best way I can do that is to act to protect the environment. I thank Jocelyn for asking me if I could speak on this webinar. And I gladly accepted for this reason. The cause of climate change are well covered with Mary's presentation. And I think a lot of us, a lot of people know what causes it and what we need to do. In my submission for this evening, addition to Mary's, I want to share something of the positive adaptation responses we have already implemented in Aitutaki. Aitutaki is the second largest island in the Cook Islands. Rarotonga is the largest, but Aitutaki is my home and my children's home. For fossil fuel, by October this year, we will have achieved 50% reduction in our fossil fuel used to generate our electricity. And we are hoping that by 2024, we will have 100% electricity supplied from solar panel. And that will take away what fossil fuel we have used in the past. So we will solely be on solar panel. The public education of climate change, this is very well evolved in the Cook Islands. Task Force Climate Change Cook Island was established in 2011 within the Office of the Prime Minister to coordinate and support all climate changes initiative within the government, as well as other non-government organizations. All the schools from preschool through to high school have very strong and effective hands-on teaching programs So the community consciousness is very high. The greatest threat to us is from our tourists from New Zealand and Australia. They are the ones who need, for example, reminding about bringing in sunscreens which bleach and destroy coral, about not stepping on corals, breaking corals, about not presuming the right to access our unpopulated islands. With tradition, I hear you, Mary, talking about your dad and the school and how it's covered by water, seawater, or flood. This is quite common also in our islands. But there are things that we have done at local level. I'm working with, as head of our traditional leaders group, to reintroduce long proven cultural practices intended to guarantee sustainability of both the lagoon and the creatures within, especially turtle. For example, several of the islands, when a nest of turtle is found, they share the eggs among the households. They give you 5 eggs, 3 eggs, and it's your job to look after these eggs until they hatch. And then you continue looking after the turtle, the baby turtle, until they are about 5 years old, when they are much bigger and can run away from big fish and from birds. So one day, everybody will come to the beach, and then we release our turtle. And they might say, Roro Daniel, you were given 5 eggs, you only got 3. That's a shame to me. When I say I only was possible to save 3 eggs. And this is how we were providing turtle the chance to multiply. We help them. And this is before anything happened about conservation of lagoon and turtle and so on. The other thing we do is cutting trees. When we plan to cut a big tree to make a boat, we say a little prayer to the Creator and thank Him for the tree and tell Him why we are cutting it before we cut it, and then we cut it and use it for our. This is how our forefathers look after the land. But today, people come with their chainsaw without any thought and just go on cutting trees without thinking about what they are doing or whether they're going to replace it. These are some of the ways we conserve what we have, the ways we look after our island. Finally, because this series is sponsored by the religious leaders, I want to say a word of both challenge and encouragement to the leaders. Across the entire Pacific, religious leaders are highly respected. I'm sure there is no Pacific Island people who doesn't listen to their ministers, to their church ministers, to their pastors, to their reverends. They are very highly respected in the islands. And they are very influential. When they stand on the pulpit and preach, the people listen to them. And they, in a way, they feel what the preachers are saying is nothing else but the truth. And they can mobilize a lot of people to do what they want. But sadly, I hear too few of them speaking directly about climate change and its multiple effect upon the environment, and thus on the quality of life for our people. I urge them to take serious their duty of care for all people of faith, and more especially their duty of care for the creation entrusted to us all to protect and sustain for the next generation. Thank you.
Fine. Thank you very much indeed, Roro. That was very helpful and really fascinating to hear about some very traditional practices, such as that wonderful one looking after turtles, to build that sense of community and restoring nature, but also a really powerful enjoinder to political leaders, religious leaders. We
also have other things, but I didn't want to bring it. But one of the most important one is rahui. We put rahui on islands that nobody can go there for 5 years, 10 years, on the ocean and on the lagoon, a way of giving the island, the lagoon, a chance to regenerate. And nobody goes there until the chief says, okay, we close the rahui on this island, we open that island that we had been closing. These are things that I think need to be awakened and need to be worked on.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Excuse me. Adam, we're very pleased to hear your thoughts on the issues and topics that Mary was presenting to us.
Kia ora. I'll talk what Mary and Dr. Daniel said. Actually, Dr. Daniel's wife was my supervisor. I'd say that I think this we in New Zealand, I think we've seen here, and I think through the example just then of rahui and other solutions, I think the real important thing here is that Aotearoa New Zealand gets behind Pacific Indigenous solutions. I think we're really good in this country at centering Pacific trauma, and we understand what's happening to the Pacific, and we understand how we're causing it. But I think we're really not very good at this country of centering Pacific wisdom and Pacific leadership and rahui and all the other solutions that we know that folks in the Pacific know best the solutions. People know the solutions to climate change. People know what reduces emissions. And so I think what New Zealand needs to do is basically get in and support it. I think we often think ourselves as a country, we think ourselves as part of the Pacific, and we think ourselves as a country of someone that backs the Pacific. But the reality is that we're not. New Zealand doesn't stand behind the Pacific when it matters. New Zealand hasn't supported, for example, in Mary's example, the non-proliferation treaty. New Zealand hasn't supported that. At COPs, at the UN climate conferences, New Zealand consistently fights against the Alliance of Small Island States. So that's the group that negotiates on behalf of the Pacific and other small island states. So New Zealand really is the bad guys here. Unfortunately, we're not getting behind the Pacific. And so I think we need to start off by acknowledging, obviously, our history, and also where we are right now, and not supporting the Pacific solutions that we know exist. So I think acknowledging that, we acknowledge what's happening and we acknowledge what we need to do about it. And we also acknowledge, obviously, the impacts here. I saw, we know thousands of New Zealanders die every year from asthma. I suffer from asthma. And so we know it's an issue in the Pacific and it's an issue here as well. Climate fueled. 4 people die every day in New Zealand from, I saw this fact like an hour ago, actually, 4 people die every day from diseases caused by fossil fuels in New Zealand. So we know the issues, and we know that that Pacific people, Indigenous people have the wisdom and the experience we need. And so what we need to do as a country is to really back that, is to back the things in negotiations, is back here. And, and of course, in this country, that also includes giving land back to mana whenua who know the climate solutions we need. I think obviously we are losing many of these things, and it's quite downtrodden and it's quite hard. We know that winning slowly on climate is losing, and we know that that it's not a case of we eventually get there. It's a case of winning slowly is losing. I think I do live with this nagging sense of ashamed hopelessness that we're not going to do it, and our movements are going to fail, and that things aren't going to go wrong. But again, I think, we know that we have the solutions, right? I think that's a really important thing. Climate change is not about waiting for a few techno fixes to fix us, for a few methane vaccines, for a few carbon sequestering systems. People in the Pacific know how to live in low emission sustainable ways. People in Māori in New Zealand do. we know the solutions. So all we need to do is to be centering those solutions and backing them and adding political power, because it's all about power, right? Who has power at the moment? It's the fossil fuel industry, as Mary said, who have been lying about climate change for 30 years, who have built oil rigs with sea level rise into account for 34 years. So they've known for more than 34 years. They've been building the oil rigs with sea level rise into account. And that's where the power happens in New Zealand. You know, we see in development of policy, every single policy I've worked with in government, the first people there are the fossil fuel industry. It's developed by the fossil fuel industry, whether that be in agriculture, whether that be in all sorts of other schemes. We have this thinking that nothing about us without us, nothing about the fossil fuel industry without the fossil fuel industry being involved. But we know that the fossil fuel industry has been lying and has been fundamental interests are rooted in high emissions. And so I think, again, what we need to do is stop listening to the fossil fuel industry and kick them out of power, because we've seen it's failed. We've seen schemes trying to reduce emissions with the industry has failed, and we need to get that stick out, and we need to be regulating the fossil fuel industry into oblivion, really, and then supporting the indigenous and specific solutions that we know work. We know they work. It just has to be about power, and we can build power by taking movements, whether that be, if you're getting your local church to divest from fossil fuels, whether that be organized with your community, whatever that be. It has to be about transferring power to the solutions and to the people we know are able to respond and have the solutions that we know needs to be done. So yeah, kia ora.
Fine, thank you very much indeed, Adam. Now, Mary, if I could, for challenging us in many ways and absolutely calling out some of the very key actors here who are working to preserve selfishly to preserve the good thing that they know they've got going for them now. Mary, if I can just come back to you, is one of the sort of lines of work and campaigning of the Pacific Climate Warriors about building understanding here and trying to build support here in Aotearoa for the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty? And if so, what are some of the ways you're doing that?
Yeah, 100%. Like Adam has already raised, New Zealand, I think people really need to understand the power and influence that New Zealand has over the Pacific. Obviously, there's the historical colonial history, but the practical power and influence that they have when it comes to decision-making tables and blocking conversations or watering down conversations that we need to be having at that level is often blocked by New Zealand or Australia. So in the context of something like the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, our Pacific countries are really clear that this is, 7 of them have been really clear that they're getting behind this. We need New Zealand to not block or water down that conversation when we're at, forums like COP, when we're in any decision-making forum, and particularly to, take the moral high ground when it comes to Australia. We know for a fact that Australia will not support something like the Fossil Fuel Treaty because of their reliance on fossil fuels. It's a huge part of their economy. So, we, in our work, often what we're doing is highlighting that New Zealand has shown this moral courage before when we talk about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Why can't we do that now when we've often referred to the climate crisis as New Zealand's young generation or new generation's nuclear-free moment? This is our moment to really step up to that plate. So there's that component in it. But a big part of our work is actually really educating our own communities around the role that fossil fuels have in really driving the climate crisis and what this treaty can offer. This treaty is not a silver bullet. Like, we're absolutely clear on that. But we can't continue to not address the elephant in the room, i.e. the biggest contributor to this crisis, and just continue as business as usual. That's, otherwise what the Pacific has to lose are our lands and our lives. And that's a very real reality for us. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, Rod. You're on mute, Rod.
I keep muting because I've got the tail end of a cold here and I don't want to splutter into the screen. But keep reminding me if I remain muted. But let's pursue the treaty a little bit further. Adam, from your perspective, here as a campaigner in Aotearoa, there is a very good plan out, the climate shift one, came out a couple of weeks ago, a 10-point climate plan. There's 40 New Zealand NGOs behind that. And it's a very good plan. I would just put a link to it in the chat box in a moment. But rightly, there's a lot of focus there on New Zealand, but could you also see, and our upcoming election, but is there also a way that NGOs here in New Zealand can really help build that understanding and pressure on our government on the non-proliferation treaty?
Absolutely. I think, yeah, I mean, that climate shift plan we developed as a focus for the election here in New Zealand. But I think that's an interesting challenge that you give there. And I think that, yeah, what we need to be doing, and we need to be doing as a climate movement in this country, is backing things like the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and backing New Zealand to take action internationally. I think, ironically, lobbying New Zealand on international issues is often, it gets technical, and often people feel like they're not able to have a say on it, and people feel like it's technical and above their level, and that's the way it's designed, right? It's designed with these very extensive consultation documents and technical language, around like at about 1 million acronyms that we're not able to understand, and so it's very difficult to get a lot of Pākehā New Zealanders to really support strongly for New Zealand's greater action in the Pacific and supporting other countries internationally. And so I think that's part of it. But I think there's a really big opportunity for the climate movement in New Zealand and for people to say, actually, we are, as Mary said, we've done good things in the past, and we know that we have the courage that's necessary. We know it can be done. There's no physical constraints to New Zealand really getting in and fighting like hell for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and fighting like hell for all these other issues. And so I think, what we need to be doing is really talking about what is New Zealand's role in the world. The government talks about New Zealand's values-based foreign policy. What does that really mean? Does that mean cozying up to the United States, or does that mean, actually, living and fighting for the people who are on our doorstep, including us as well? And so, I totally talk about that, and I think that New Zealand can and must do far more. And we, as a climate movement, need to be really clear that, yes, in particular, non-proliferation treaty, but we need to be really clear that we are not okay with New Zealand sitting back, because there's two responses to climate change, right? It's not just about emissions. We see it in Europe. One response is a more equitable, compassionate country where we bring people on board, where everyone has more together, where we have more connected communities and we live in harmony and all these great things. And the other option is we're seeing countries like Austria and Italy going down this really far right, we're going to shut our borders, and New Zealand is a destination for billionaires who will prop up on our economy, and we're going to shut our borders, and everyone else who gets climate change can be screwed over, and there are two options. Climate change is not just about a single pathway and a single story, and we must be really clear about this compassionate, thing about this, bringing everyone on board, because everyone's impacted on this issue. And so I think we need to be really clear on which path we want to go through, and the more we talk about it, the better.
Thank you. Actually, two things. First of all, there's a number of comments in the Q&A urging action and support and wondering how to offer support for the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so you've touched on some key mechanisms there. So there's certainly very keen interest amongst our audience. But Mary, if I may pick up on the restorative justice way of looking at these issues, how do you see that playing out and helping to contribute, bringing people together in dealing with the climate crisis?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I do want to center first off that the concept of restorative justice is not a Western or new concept to Pacific peoples. So what I'm talking about is essentially it's recognizing when harm has been done, and that the person who has harmed and the person who has been harmed often can be the ones that come together to find the solution forward. And so there's a practice in Samoa that's called like the ifonga. So if for whatever reason there's been some harm done, perhaps from one person to another person or another family to another family, the person who's done the harm, will often sit outside the other person, the victim's home, with an ear or like a fine mat over them, kind of in an expression of recognizing the harm that's been done and their readiness to move forward to find a solution. And so I think where restorative justice comes in, particularly in alignment to the concept of climate justice, is really accepting the scale of harm that frontline and Indigenous communities have faced because of the climate crisis. A crisis that has been fueled by human activity. And so, there is a lot of Indigenous voice in a lot of these spaces, but I don't think we're really moving at the pace and with the genuine intention to provide those reparations, to address the harm that's been done to these communities who haven't contributed to this crisis. So I think restorative justice really drives us to look at, that healing and that restoration. How can we recognize the harm that Indigenous peoples have experienced, and how do we work towards addressing them? And I think, it really presents us an opportunity to bridge the ineffectiveness of the current environmental processes towards correcting those harmful practices. And so, for me, the fossil fuel treaty, I'm absolutely aware and cognizant of how ambitious it is, but that's what it will take for us to see some movement and not incremental movement in addressing the harm that a lot of our communities have faced. So, I think really understanding that harm, that there has been deep harm that communities are facing now, some more than others at the moment, but what we feel in the Pacific, the rest of the world will soon feel. And you see that already in New Zealand. Rod, you're on mute again.
Thank you. I appreciate the prompts. Ro, if I may ask you from a Cook Islands perspective, are you seeing processes that reflect that restorative justice approach to these issues in your own islands?
The problem, Rod, is that we were looking after our island very well. And then some white man brought a car. And then we thought to ourselves, this guy has got a good life. He's running around on the car and we are walking. So we decided to be like the white man, buy more cars. And this is the problem now, getting rid of it. But when we are trying as chief on the island to do something about it. But we also need our local government and our mother government to go along with us. But I remember when we were talking about cigarette smoking, and we said by 2025, we will have Waitutagi smoke-free. At present, people on the island, when you see someone smoking, or someone sees you while he was smoking, he feels out of place. He'll go somewhere where nobody sees him smoking. So this is creating an environment of smoking is not good to the other people watching you. So we are hoping that we'll be able to have a free smoking island by 2025. And I hear that my son told me that by 2035, New Zealand fuel cars will no longer be allowed to run. You got to have a electric car. And this is good. And I think the way to go is to make laws, legislation for the use of and also put a timeline by so-and-so a date, there won't be any more fossil fuel arriving to our island.
Yeah.
Getting to our island. we will use how you say, green power, solar panels and so on.
Yeah.
And I think if we push our members of parliament to go into the discussion and bring out a law that stops the use of fossil fuel on each island by certain dates, I think that will push it much faster, especially the fossil non-proliferation treaty.
There's a strongly related question here from Mike, both to you, Roro, and to Mary. How do you see a rapid transition in Pacific Island countries from fossil fuel-based aviation tourism to more sustainable sources of income? How does that dynamic fit into the big challenges for you?
Well, unfortunately for us, on my island, we get about more than 100,000 tourists a year. And we have discussed this in our meetings that because I put it that we are getting too many people on an island of 1,400 people. And then when a tourist boat arrives in and you are getting 3,000 tourists, the infrastructure is not catered for such a lot of people. But the business people is fighting to continue having this kind of tourists come to our island. But we are fighting to limit the number, and that fight is still going on. Yeah.
And Mary, from a tourism point of view, on one hand, I mean, it's a terrible dilemma for all of us. On one hand, we still want the connection, the ability to travel, to meet each other, to work together. So it's very hard to imagine not having that connection, that physical and personal connection with communities across the Pacific and back to Aotearoa. But then there's the question of tourists. So given that aviation is going to remain fossil fuel based for quite a long time to come, especially over those long distances, how are you working with that dynamic in your campaigning?
Yeah, because I also saw there was another question around what we're doing on our own islands. And I want to center first that the Pacific, collectively, all of the Pacific Island states emit less than 0.04% of the world's total carbon emissions. So if we were all to go 100% solar powered, that would have little to no impact on the total global carbon emissions. So I think it's first important to recognize that the onus doesn't fall on these tiny islands in the vast Pacific to completely go solar powered to address and, model this, and so that first and foremost. In saying that, the first country and the only country in the world to go 100% solar powered is Tokelau. So I first want to just ground that there. When we're talking about tourism and aviation, fossil fueled aviation, the issue isn't, there are issues with tourism, but tourism itself can continue to occur and flying can continue to occur if we were to find solutions where we're not reliant on fossil fuels. So, that's part of that peaceful and equitable transition. So what does that look like in the context of, the Pacific? What does an equitable transition look like? If we were then to require tourism to vastly shift, what would be the implications that we would need to consider? And is it equitable or is it not? And how do we address that? And that's what the treaty offers, is understanding that many communities, if we think about many countries in Africa who are also on the front lines, they are heavily dependent on fossil fuels. So we're not that, we're not saying stop fossil fuels tomorrow, figure it out the day after. We're saying we need to have, one, stop the proliferation or the production of fossil fuels. We don't need any more fossil fuels above the ground. Of what we do have, how can we start to phase that out? And then that peaceful and equitable transition. What does that feel like and look like in the unique context that we need to consider, i.e. the pace that the global north need to move is not the same pace that the global south should move, because the challenges are different. So if we were to require everyone to move at that same pace, it would be an inequitable transition.
I think there's a couple of really core principles that come out of that about equitable transitions, is that no one bunch of people should expect another bunch of people to do stuff that they're not doing themselves. But secondly, there is a great opportunity around the world for people to leapfrog existing technologies or heavy dependence on existing technologies. And therefore, the way we saw, for example, mobile phones take over in African countries that hardly had any landline phones. And so the other part of another core principle of equitable transitions is, and just ones, is that we who have resources should give a lot of support to those people who don't, to be able to make those leaps. So I think it's really important we think in those sorts of terms. But could we just go back to hearing a little bit more about some of the projects of the Pacific Climate Warriors that donations today might be able to help you with? Oh, it's you're mute.
I am on mute. Damn, I thought I could get through this session without doing that.
That's all right.
Where our team and a collective of allies and friends of the Warriors are actually coming together to launch our treaty campaign in New Zealand. So lots of the conversations that we're starting to have now, including this, is a bit of a soft launch. So the ways that I would definitely recommend to get in touch with the Pacific Climate Warriors in Aotearoa is via our Gmail, which is pacificclimatewarriors.aotearoa@gmail.com, and I can put that in the chat. Follow us on our social media. You'll be able to see the series of events and activities that will start to happen, especially in the months leading up to COP. And then also I can just share the treaty website for people to engage with. But I guess one big thing that I would say in terms of the treaty campaign in New Zealand is that if you are organizations, so I would love to see the Religious Diversity Centre endorse the treaty, if that's something that you would be able to do. Individual organizations can endorse the treaty. For those, activists and community leaders that are on this webinar, call on your local councils, your local leaders to endorse the treaty. Have that discussion now so that we're not having to push so hard for New Zealand to not block conversations. That's the ultimate goal for us, is that we can start to see our councils and eventually our government endorse the treaty.
Fine, thank you. I know people will really welcome the opportunity to stay in touch and to see how we might be able to help from here in Aotearoa with those in those campaigns. So thank you. Excuse me. Coming back to you, Adam, would you like to? Is there an opportunity? What sort of opportunities would you see in terms of specific actions we citizens in Aotearoa can take to help our Pacific neighbours?
I think, again, I mean, one of them is coming together as being part of a community, is building climate resilience through, connected communities. And I think part of that is what you said before, is talking about the importance of the Pacific with our friends, with our families. We know that politicians are a balloon tied to the rock of public opinion, so we can swat at the politician, but eventually, at the end of the day, the rock of public opinion is what matters. So I think it's number one by talking about I think centering having these things like you're having with Dr. Daniel and having Mary talk about it in the public, being educated and learning about this. I think another one, again, is really just calling on our government for an independent foreign policy that backs the Pacific. I think another one is, again, coming together. It has to be about building power, right? It has to be about building power for climate justice and building power for, and empowering Pacific people in New Zealand. So I think that, again, has to be about who are we centering voices of, thinking about that, and thinking about, when we come together, if whether it's your local 350 or your church group or whatever it is, it's just really calling on people. Hey, we can say, hey, you might say to your church council, well, because of what I've heard from this webinar or whatever, it's really important that we divest from fossil fuels, which are putting at risk Pacific countries. And so I think it's about that. It's about building power. It's about whatever the thing is, whatever your local group is. It's about coming together with other people, taking action, building collective action. Sometimes it's strategic, sometimes things fail, whatever. But along the way, we build power and we have community, and we feel like we're empowered citizens and we're able to take a change. So I think that's what we have to be doing ultimately. But all about community.
Absolutely. And yes to all of that. And I'll just also draw people's notice to the chat box to the various links that Mary has put in there about helping the Pacific climate warriors with their work and campaigns. Just going back to our Q&A, there's a lovely comment here from Nizar, who had been working as a government person here in New Zealand in years past, working with Pacific neighbours. And he is expressing surprise that those relationships have changed so much in 20 years on from that. It makes us sound as though we're starting to sound like Australians with their coal mine driven priorities. I do take very seriously that New Zealand is playing a multi-pronged negotiation strategy and isn't always sort of shoulder to shoulder with the Pacific communities. But is there still a positive side of that relationship, excuse me, from the government to the Pacific on climate issues in terms of various areas of support, but also in international negotiations playing a supportive role with Pacific countries? Are there some balancing factors in this that you're seeing, Mary or Adam?
I might defer to Adam because he's been in those maybe international forums a bit more than I have.
I'd just say, everything's nuanced, right? I think New Zealand does some good things, some great things, but I think, and I think that Neil's been right. There's been times in our history that Mary referred to before of us doing the right thing and backing Pacific countries. Sometimes it's taken too long, but New Zealand's done the right thing and occasionally still does. But I think it's about the overall story. And the other thing here, I think, is a lot of these are things behind closed doors, right? In the public, New Zealand's making really sure to pay for Pacific, pavilions or Pacific, or, sponsor Pacific delegates to come to conferences. And those things are really important and great. But a lot of the things is, the fundamental nature of these, a lot of these really crucial negotiations are all happen behind closed doors, especially now with COVID, right? Whereas usually people might be able to knock up someone on the pathway and talk to them. It's all happening behind closed doors on Zooms. And it's not nothing about us us without us. So people from the Pacific often aren't part of these discussions. And, you know, I 2 examples that I could give right now that, you know, on climate finance and on loss and damage. New Zealand, you know, many countries have asked New Zealand to co-sponsor things at COP and other forums. People say, New Zealand, come along with us and say, hey, we're going to support X climate finance, we're going to support X, you know, thing. And ultimately New Zealand doesn't do that, largely because we want to be able to keep emitting as much as we can and pay as little as possible in reparations, as little as possible in loss and damage costs for the emissions we've caused to Pacific countries for economic reasons. And so I think it's a complex story, but I think that it is hard because things are behind closed doors. But I think the more we really give a big social license for standing with the Pacific in reality, and it's back with everything else. If New Zealand has really strong, you know, the stronger we are on climate, the stronger we're then able to be, and we're able to do more climate damage. We're able to find funds in other areas. So it has to be about priorities, and it has to be about making discussion public, bringing things into the public realm so that we can all participate and we can all talk about it. It can't just be make the decision and then go and do some consultation with Pacific people and with other people after the fact.
Yeah, thank you. This is a practical question I'm just following up on from Judy in the Q&A. She's concerned about not being able to save the details that Mary has posted in the chat. I will make sure that I'm saving the chat discussion at this end, and when we send out an email, thank you all for joining us, I'll make sure that those details from Mary are in that email. So don't worry, Judy will sort that out.
Rod, could I just say one thing in addition to Adam? The Pacific is not at all contesting the good things that New Zealand has done. So, for example, yes, NZA in New Zealand did fund our solar panels 100% in Tokelau. Kapai, but what we're really trying to drive at is that as the climate leaders in this climate crisis who have that lived experience and are very clear on what the solutions need to be and what we need to be prioritizing, whether it's ending fossil fuels or loss and damage, we need New Zealand to understand the influence and the power that they have and stand with us as boldly as they do in terms of their public statements or commitment in action. So behind those closed doors, we need New Zealand to be going hard to say, yes, we back you. Yes, don't worry. We're gonna speak out boldly and strongly around, you know, any resistance that you get from Australia. That's what we need. So we're not at all contesting what New Zealand has done, but, you know, those incremental things seem big to New Zealand, but it's actually not to the Pacific because it's not reaping the fruits of what we need for our islands to survive. And I'm sharing a real reality for us is that, you know, for Tokelau, there is a real reality that in 10, 20 years, Tokelau will be underwater. And I don't think New Zealand really comprehend what the implication of that will be in the context of New Zealand. We can barely look after the Māori and Pacific and, you know, communities that we have in Aotearoa already. Our social welfare systems, our systems are not set up already to look after our people. How can we guarantee that we're going to be able to look after the influx of climate refugees that will come to New Zealand first and foremost if we don't address this? So that's the picture that we're trying to really paint, is what happens in the Pacific will be felt first and foremost in Aotearoa.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, what I'm going to do, because I'm suggesting we will close in 5 minutes or so, because we're already 8 minutes past our theoretical end time. I'm going to ask the three of you, and I will respond myself too, to something that I hadn't said I was going to ask you, which is quite simply this. The whole theme of this webinar series is about building hope. And I was wondering if each of you could just give us an example of what keeps you going, or where you find hope. And whilst you're seeing as I've sprung that question on you, what I'm going to do is just say that speaking for myself, It's very much about the role of young people, and of course, those young at heart. I'm a great fan of the Third Act organization in the United States for older people, a parallel organization to 350.org for younger people. But it's the creativity, the energy, the dynamism, the commitment of young people in this where I find hope. And to that end, I'm just going to post in chat an article that we had on Newsroom this morning from one of my excellent colleagues there, Nikki Mando, about how the most recent really important court case in the US state of Montana, which is spurring campaigners here to double their efforts in the legal system to push harder on this. And so that would be an example for me of where I find hope. So if I may ask, say, Adam, you're deep in the thick of all this. How do you help keep yourself going through this? Where do you find the hope?
I think Rebecca Solnit says that we've always been good at imagining the end of the world, which is much easier to picture than the strange sidelong paths of change in a world without end. And and someone else said, I think it was it's like people say it's hard to imagine a climate safe future where we have good public services and we look after the Pacific and we've done all these things, but it was so did the divine right of kings and all these other things, right? That seem impossible and seem really difficult suddenly can change if we can change everything. We saw with COVID, I think, we saw it again with COVID. Everyone said this, but we know that, we immediately basically found enough accommodation for every homeless person in New Zealand, just like that. We shut down motorways, we got cars off the road, just like that. And there were many failed and inequities in the COVID response as well, of course. But it really showed when we mobilize, we can do whatever we want. We can, we can create whatever we want to see. We can create a Ministry of Green Works with thousands of clean jobs for everyone across the country. We can, we can have jobs for nature, giving people jobs to, pest control and restoring nature. We can give land back and resources back to mana whenua to deliver the solutions that they know. And so I think everything is 100% possible. It's just beyond the horizon. And again, every bit of a degree matters, right? It's never entirely too late. Maybe, it's hard to say that because Tokelau will be underwater after a certain point. But again, every fraction of a degree means thousands of lives saved and thousands of graves in the Pacific saved. And every fraction of a degree really matters. So it's never too late completely, but we have to do everything we can. We've already had a runaway climate. We've already had severe catastrophic locked in, but we can completely change everything just like we had before, and we can 100% do it again. It's all about political will. It's all about political will. Yeah.
Thank you. And Roro, for you in the Cook Islands and as family here in New Zealand and friends across the Pacific, what's something that gives you hope in all this?
I go to church every Sabbath, and my hope is within me, and my faith and belief that our Creator has created a beautiful island for us, and it's my job to make sure it remains that way, or it's my job to make sure it is going to be looked after by my grandchildren, and this is why I worked a little bit on this climate change problem.
Good, thank you. And Mary, apart from my very brief summary, the last word falls to you as our main speaker today. Where lies hope for you?
In a lot of places, actually. I was reflecting on this a lot in my own faith journey and what that means, and I'm laughing because some of my team are listening in, and many of the young people that I work with, as you do when you're a young person, you're on this journey of self-discovery, and for a lot of them is also re-indigenization and reclaiming their language and their cultures and their land, or the connections to land. And what often comes with this that is then confronting realities that often the faith or institution or faith that you grew up in has done so much harm to a lot of our communities, and having to reconcile that fact and also still holding on to faith. And for me, that's okay. It's okay to sit with those two really confronting realities that the same institutions that actually have really harmed the Pacific are now starting to move towards actually leading, I guess, a restorative justice approach to healing and addressing those harms in the climate crisis. And so for me, what I hold on to hope with is, regardless of whether you are a person of faith or whether you're not, everyone who's in this climate movement I think, is holding on to this unrelenting hope that we can do better. And we see that in the Pacific. You know, we've been told so many times that we're being too ambitious, or that's never likely to go through. You know, we were told that when young people pushed 1.5 to stay alive. That campaign, that resulted in it being in the Paris Agreement. The advisory opinion on human rights and climate change from the International Court of Justice, you know, there were so many barriers that were put up there. Now the fossil fuel treaty, you know, no one thought that would ever take off, but it's there, like we're doing it. And so regardless of where you are, how you find faith or find hope or sustain that, I think if you're in the movement, you inherently have some hope and faith in you that we can do better. Otherwise, we wouldn't be on this webinar, and we wouldn't be talking about solutions. So I guess that's my encouragement.
Fine. Thank you very much indeed. And to further that, I just put back in the chat box that appeal for donations and the two links for ways to send money that we can then on pass to the likes of Mary's organizations and to other organizations identified by speakers in the other three webinars. So I just want to thank you, Roro and Adam and Mary, so much for being with us this evening, and for the very large audience of you that have been with us this evening. The YouTube recordings of these presentations very quickly turn up on the Religious Diversity Centre website. The two previous sessions are already up there. This one will be soon too. And then please do tune in next Wednesday for our main speaker, the Honourable Helen Clark, and we'll have some other people with us, 3 other people with us to help in that discussion too. So I just bid you thank you once again for being with us, and on behalf of my colleagues in the Religious Diversity Centre Climate Action Group, thank you hugely, and go well, and we hope to see many of you back next week. So bye for now.